It's strange how silence can become a sound. That was the first thing I noticed when I arrived at my grandparents' secluded cabin for Christmas. No birds, no crunch of snow under unseen animals, just an endless, suffocating hush that made the falling snow feel like ash. I had been reluctant to come this year. Grandma had passed last spring, and Grandpa was too frail to make it to the city. Mom begged me to drive up to spend Christmas with him so he wouldn't be alone. "It'll only be a couple of nights," she promised, guilt heavy in her voice. So, with a trunk full of hastily wrapped presents and a thermos of coffee, I made the trek into the wilderness. When I arrived, the cabin looked almost picturesque. Frosted windows, smoke curling from the chimney, and a wreath hanging crookedly on the door. But as I stepped inside, the warmth I expected didn't greet me. Instead, there was a draft that carried the faint, metallic scent of decay. I chalked it up to Grandpa forgetting to take out the trash. Grandpa was in his rocking chair by the fire, staring at the flames. He didn't turn when I called his name. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched like I'd struck him. "Oh, it's you," he muttered, his voice hoarse. His eyes darted to the windows and then to the dark hallway that led to the bedrooms. "Thought you'd be here earlier." There was something off about him. His hands trembled, not with the usual frailty of age, but as though he were cold or frightened. I helped him to the kitchen, where we sat down to dinner. The silence between us stretched until I couldn't take it anymore. "Grandpa, are you okay?" I asked. "You seem, I don't know, worried about something." He stared at me for a long moment, then leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see her outside?" I froze. "See who?" He didn't answer, just shook his head and went back to poking at his food. I brushed it off as old age, maybe he'd been hallucinating, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his question left behind. After Grandpa went to bed, I settled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fire die down. The quiet felt oppressive, and every creak of the cabin made my heart jump. Around midnight, I heard Ida faint tap, tap, tap at the window. I told myself it was just a tree branch, but the rhythm was too deliberate. 3 taps, pause, then 3 more. Gathering what little courage I had, I crept to the window and peeked out. At first, all I saw was snow swirling under the porch light. But then, just at the edge of the trees, I saw her. A woman, pale as the snow itself, wearing a tattered dress that fluttered unnaturally in the still air. Her face was obscured by a curtain of long, dark hair, but I could feel her gaze piercing through me. She raised a hand, skeletal and trembling, and pointed directly at the cabin. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. By the time I dared to look again, she was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of sleepless paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a harbinger of her return. When dawn finally broke, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and Grandpa's eerie behavior. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the tapping came from the back door. I refused to look, paralyzed with fear. Grandpa shuffled out of his room and sat in his rocking chair, staring at the door with vacant eyes. "She won't come in unless you let her," he murmured. I didn't ask who he meant. I didn't want to know. Instead, I barricaded the door with whatever I could find and stayed awake until morning. By Christmas morning, I was ready to leave. I packed my things, making excuses about needing to get back early. Grandpa didn't protest. He just handed me an old, tarnished bell and said, "Keep this with you. It'll keep her away." I didn't want to take it, but the look in his eyes told me it wasn't a request. I drove away, the bell on the passenger seat, its faint jingling keeping me company as I left the cabin far behind. That night, back in my apartment, I was finally starting to relax when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was at my living room window end. I live on the 3rd floor. I didn't look. I just clutched the bell and prayed it would stop. The tapping eventually faded, but the feeling of being watched never left. Even now, weeks later, I keep the bell close, its tarnished surface a constant reminder of what I saw or what saw me. And every so often, when the nights are especially quiet, I still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. It started with the carolers. Every year, the neighborhood's holiday tradition was a group of carolers residents who would don festive hats and scarves, clutching sheet music, and go door to door singing Christmas classics. It was charming, if a little old-fashioned. I'd see them from my window, their breath visible in the freezing air, as they brought cheer to each doorstep. But this year, they didn't show up. It wasn't until Christmas Eve that we heard the first knock. It was faint, almost hesitant, but unmistakable against the quiet hum of my evening. I glanced at the clock. 8:13 p.m. Carolers usually came earlier, but perhaps they'd been delayed. When I opened the door, my stomach sank. There were no neighbors in Santa hats, no jingling bells or warm smiles. Instead, 3 figures stood on the porch, their faces obscured by heavy scarves and shadows cast by the dim porch light. They didn't sing, they didn't move. They just stood there, silent and still, like mannequins in the snow. Merry Christmas?" I managed, my voice trembling. The words hung in the air, unanswered. I noticed their clothes weren't festive, but old and tattered, like costumes from a forgotten era. One of them held what looked like a songbook, but its cover was faded, the edges frayed, as though it had been left out in the elements for years. "Are you caroling?" I asked, forcing a smile. Still no response, just the faint sound of wind whistling through the trees. Unnerved, I closed the door, locking it behind me. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see them walking away, but they hadn't moved. They remained rooted in place, their heads tilted slightly toward the door, as if listening. I turned off the porch light and drew the curtains, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But when I went upstairs to my bedroom, I could still hear Thema faint rustling, like snow crunching underfoot. Except it wasn't moving away, it was circling the house. Around 10 p.m., I heard singing. It started faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder. The melody was haunting, the kind of tune that wormed its way into your mind and refused to leave. The words were indistinct, but the voices slow, dissonant, and chilling sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a Christmas song. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. I called my neighbor, Mr. Halverson, who lived across the street. He was a retired cop and someone I'd always trusted to keep a level head. "Halverson speaking," he answered gruffly. "It's me, Clara," I whispered. "There's people outside. Carolers, I think. But they're acting really strange." There was a pause on the other end. "Don't open the door," he said firmly. "Last year, something similar happened down by Maple Street. People called them carolers. But Clara, those weren't people." My heart thudded in my chest. "What do you mean?" "Just stay inside. Keep your doors locked and don't respond to them, no matter what they do." The line went dead. By midnight, the singing stopped. For a brief moment, I thought they were gone, but then came a new sound, scratching at the windows. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the glass, but it grew more insistent, more deliberate. I didn't dare look. Instead, I retreated to my bedroom closet, clutching my phone and a flashlight. Then, the whispering began. It was right outside my bedroom door, soft and unintelligible, but unmistakably human. The voices overlapped, some pleading, others laughing, their tones disjointed and wrong. I held my breath, my pulse roaring in my ears. The doorknob rattled, slow at first, then violently, as though someone were trying to force it open. Clara, a voice crooned, low and melodic. It sounded like my mother's, though she had died 2 years ago. "Come out, sweetheart. They just want to sing for you." Tears streamed down my face as I pressed my back against the wall. I knew better than to answer. The doorknob stopped moving, but the whispering continued, circling the room like a predator stalking its prey. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke, the sun was peeking through the curtains. The house was silent. I crept downstairs, every step slow and deliberate, half expecting to find them waiting for me. But the porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. The only sign they'd been there was a single, tattered page lying on the welcome mat. It was sheet music, its notes scrawled in an alien, almost unrecognizable script. At the top of the page was a title, "The Last Carol." I've kept the page, though I'm not sure why. Maybe as proof, maybe as a warning. And every Christmas Eve, as the clock strikes 8:13 p.m., I brace myself, wondering if this will be the year they return. It all began when I found the snow globe. I was browsing through an old thrift shop in the days leading up to Christmas. The shelves were crammed with forgotten trinkets, faded ornaments, and dusty holiday decorations that seemed to have lost their charm decades ago. Among the clutter, my eyes landed on a snow globe tucked into a corner. It was small, with a delicate glass dome encasing a miniature cabin surrounded by pine trees. When I picked it up, the snow inside stirred without me shaking it. I figured it was just static electricity or a loose mechanism, but something about the scene inside felt off. The tiny cabin's windows were dark, its door slightly ajar, and the snow seemed to fall too slowly, like it was underwater. Still, it had a rustic charm, and for $1, I thought it would make a unique addition to my decorations. That night, I placed the snow globe on the mantel above the fireplace. As I admired it, a strange sense of unease crept over me. It felt like the little cabin inside was watching me. Shaking off the feeling, I went to bed, but my dreams were restless. I kept seeing the cabin from the snow globe, except it wasn't empty. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, beckoning me closer. When I woke, the snow globe was no longer on the mantel. I found it on the coffee table in the living room. Even though I hadn't touched it, I tried to laugh it off, maybe I'd moved it and forgotten. But as I examined it, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin. By the third day, the unease had turned into dread. Every time I looked at the snow globe, something inside had changed. The footprints now led into the forest. The trees seemed to shift slightly, their branches angling as if to obscure the path, and the cabin door, which had been ajar, was now wide open. That night, I woke to the sound of faint tapping. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking on a distant door. I followed the sound downstairs, heart pounding, to find the snow globe on the floor in the center of the living room. Its glass surface was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been. The snow inside was swirling violently, even though the globe hadn't been moved. As I stared at it, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was coming from the front door. Against my better judgment, I opened it. No one was there. Only the empty street and the falling snow greeted me. But when I turned back, I froze. Standing in the middle of my living room was the shadowy figure from my dreams. It had no discernible features, just a dark, towering silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. It didn't move or speak. It only pointed toward the snow globe. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving aimlessly through the empty streets. The snow globe was still in my hands, its glass icy against my skin. I wanted to throw it out the window, but some force compelled me to keep it. Eventually, I found myself back at the thrift shop where I'd bought it. The lights were off, and a handwritten sign on the door read, "Closed permanently." Desperate, I smashed the snow globe against the concrete steps. The glass shattered, and the tiny cabin inside crumbled into dust. For a moment, I felt relief, but then I saw them, footprints in the snow, leading away from the shop and disappearing into the darkness. And when I returned home, the snow globe was back on my mantle, its glass unbroken, the cabin inside now occupied by two shadowy figures. Christmas Eve in our town was always quiet. Tucked away in a snow-covered valley, the world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath before the magic of Christmas morning. But last year, something happened that changed the way I look at the holiday forever. I had been staying with my uncle in his sprawling old Victorian house. It was an imposing structure, all gables and wrought iron details, perched on the edge of a dense forest. Uncle Peter was a historian, obsessed with the town's past, and his house reflected that, filled with dusty tomes, antique furniture, and relics from a bygone era. One such relic was a set of ornate brass bells that he kept on the mantelpiece in the parlor. "These are special," he told me, his voice low. "They're older than this house, older than the town itself. The story goes that they belonged to a monastery that burned down centuries ago. The monks who lived there, well, let's just say they weren't the pious sort." He refused to elaborate further, but his tone left little doubt that the bells were more than just decorative. That night, as the snow fell in soft, silent heaps outside, I found myself drawn to them. They were beautiful, their surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when the light hit them just right. At midnight, I heard the bells ring. It was faint at first, a single chime that echoed through the house. I froze, staring at the mantelpiece. The bells hadn't moved. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone were ringing them in the next room. But when I opened the parlor door, the house was dark and still. "Uncle Peter?" I called out, but there was no answer. The third chime was deafening. It reverberated through my chest, shaking the floorboards beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my eyes fixed on the bells, which now glowed faintly in the darkness. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision, something tall and thin, darting across the room too quickly to be human. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The only response was the creak of the old house settling. But then I saw them figures, materializing in the shadows, cloaked in darkness, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They stood motionless, surrounding the room, their presence suffocating. One of them stepped forward, and I could finally see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its hood was empty, a void where a face should have been. Yet, I could feel its gaze, cold and invasive, as it raised a hand and pointed to the bells. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The answer came not in words, but in a vision. The room dissolved, replaced by the burning monastery Uncle Peter had mentioned. I saw the monks, twisted and inhuman, chanting as they rang the very same bells. Their words were incomprehensible, but the intent was clear. They were summoning something, and the bells were the key. When I blinked, I was back in the parlor. The figures were gone, but the bells still glowed, their eerie light casting unnatural shadows on the walls. I grabbed a blanket and ran upstairs, locking myself in my room until morning. When the sun finally rose, Uncle Peter found me huddled in the corner, clutching a candlestick for protection. I told him everything, expecting him to dismiss it as a nightmare. Instead, his face turned ashen. "They've chosen you," he muttered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "The bells. They're not just relics, they're a beacon. Once you hear their call, they'll follow you." I begged him to destroy them, but he shook his head. "It won't matter. The bells are only the beginning." I left that morning, vowing never to return to that house. But as the year went on, I began to notice strange things. Shadows that lingered too long, faint chiming in the dead of night, and the sensation of being watched. Now, as Christmas approaches again, I've started hearing the bells once more. This time, they're closer. It was my first Christmas in the old house. The house had been a steal, a sprawling Victorian tucked away in a quiet New England town. Sure, it needed work, but I couldn't resist the charm of the high ceilings, the creaky wooden floors, and the attic cavernous space that held decades of forgotten history. I moved in just weeks before Christmas and decided to explore the attic while unpacking. The space was cold and dimly lit, with cobwebs clinging to the rafters. Among the boxes of dusty ornaments and yellowed newspapers, I found a small wooden trunk, its brass latch rusted shut. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. Inside was a doll. It was old, with a porcelain face that had faded over time. Its glass eyes were an unnerving shade of pale blue, and its mouth was frozen in a faint, knowing smile. The doll's dress was tattered, its lace edges frayed, but it was clear that it had once been beautiful. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an immediate unease. But instead of putting it back, I brought it downstairs, intending to display it as a quirky decoration. That was my first mistake. The first night, I placed the doll on the mantel above the fireplace. I'd barely turned off the lights and climbed into bed when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I told myself it was just the house settling and tried to ignore it. By the second night, the noises had grown louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed down the hallway outside my bedroom. I mustered the courage to check, but the hall was empty. The doll, however, was no longer on the mantel. I found it sitting on the stairs, its pale blue eyes staring up at me. I locked it in a cabinet after that, but the next morning the cabinet door was wide open and the doll was back on the mantel. By the third night, I began to notice other things. My reflection in the windows seemed delayed, as if the person staring back wasn't quite me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too quick and faint to fully register. And the doll, it seemed to change. Its smile grew wider, its eyes sharper, as if it was watching me more intently. Desperate, I called my friend Sarah. She came over the next day, brushing off my fears with a nervous laugh. "It's just an old doll," she said, holding it up to the light. "Probably worth some money, actually." That night, Sarah called me in a panic. She'd taken the doll home, thinking it might cheer me up to get it out of the house. But now, she was hearing things too, soft whispers. The sound of tiny feet running across her hardwood floors. She swore she saw its head move. By the time I got to her apartment the next morning, Sarah was gone. The front door was ajar, her phone left on the coffee table, and the doll was sitting upright on her couch. Its smile was wider than ever. I threw the doll into the river that afternoon, weighted down with bricks. For weeks, I thought I was free. But on Christmas Eve, as I was setting out gifts beneath the tree, I saw it sitting among the presents, its pale blue eyes glinting in the firelight. This time, it wasn't smiling. Growing up, I always loved Christmas. The lights, the snow, and the cheerful carolers who came around every year. made it magical. But last Christmas, something happened that I can't explain, something that still haunts me every time I hear a carol sung. It started late on Christmas Eve. I had stayed in my parents' old house for the holiday, a cozy little place on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The streets were silent, blanketed in snow, and the world seemed still. I was wrapping the last of the presents when I heard singing. The melody was soft and faint, carried on the cold wind. At first, it was comforting. Silent Night, I thought, one of my favorite carols. I assumed it was a group of carolers making their rounds, even though it was close to midnight. Curious, I peered out the window. Under the glow of the streetlight, a small group stood at the end of the driveway. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, long coats, scarves, and bonnets that seemed straight out of a Victorian Christmas card. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their breath didn't mist in the frosty air. Despite the oddity, their harmony was mesmerizing. I opened the door slightly to get a better listen, but as soon as I did, their singing stopped. They turned to look at me in unison, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Their eyes, they were hollow, black voids that seemed to drink in the light. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart racing. When I dared to look out the window again, they were gone. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a prank, I told myself. But as the night wore on, the singing returned. This time, it came from the backyard. The same haunting harmony, the same eerie perfection. I crept to the back window, but the yard was empty. The sound, however, grew louder, as if they were right outside. I turned on every light in the house, hoping to chase away whatever was out there. The singing stopped again, replaced by a heavy silence. But then came the knock, a single, deliberate tap at the front door. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called my dad, who was staying at a hotel nearby. He answered groggily, but promised to come over. While I waited, the knocking continued, slow and methodical, always in sets of 3. When my dad arrived, the knocking stopped. I let him in and told him everything. He laughed nervously, chalking it up to my imagination, or perhaps a neighborhood prank. To humor me, he checked outside. The snow was undisturbed, not a single footprint leading to the door. But I knew what I'd seen, and worse, I knew what I'd heard. That night, I didn't sleep. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old house louder. When morning finally came, I felt a small measure of relief until I found the note. It was on the porch, written in an elegant, looping script on yellowed paper. "We sang for you. Next year, you will join us. Since then, I've dreaded the arrival of Christmas. No matter where I go, I hear the carols on Christmas Eve, growing closer each year. And deep down, I know, one day, they'll come to take me." Christmas Eve was supposed to be magical, but last year, it became a nightmare I can't escape. I had been visiting my parents in a neighboring town and decided to take the late train back to the city. The station was nearly deserted, the cold biting through my coat as I waited on the platform. Snow fell in heavy, silent flakes, muffling the world around me. When the train pulled in, its headlights cut through the gloom, and I stepped aboard without hesitation. The carriage was almost empty. Just a few scattered passengers, a man in a tattered coat, hunched over a newspaper, a woman knitting quietly, and a pair of children playing with a wooden toy. Their presence reassured me. I chose a seat near the middle and settled in for the hour-long journey. The train moved with a rhythmic clatter, and I stared out at the snow-covered fields slipping past. After a while, I noticed something odd. The train wasn't stopping at any of the usual stations. Instead, it sped through, the platforms eerily dark and empty. I glanced at the other passengers, but none of them seemed concerned. "Excuse me," I said to the woman knitting across from me. "Do you know when we'll reach Green Hill Station?" She didn't look up. Her needles clicked steadily, her lips moving silently, as if reciting a prayer. Unease crept over me. I turned to the man with the newspaper. "Sir, do you know?" He lowered the paper, and my breath caught in my throat. His face was wrong. His features were blurred, as though smeared by an unseen hand. He stared at me with empty eyes, and then he smiled. A slow, unnatural grin that spread too wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellow. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and bumped into the children. Their wooden toy clattered to the floor, but when I turned to apologize, they were gone. The seat where they had been was empty. Panic set in. I hurried to the next carriage, but it was the same. Passengers with distorted faces, some staring blankly out the windows, others turning to watch me with those too wide smiles. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim light. "What is this?" I whispered, gripping the back of a seat for support. The train began to slow, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I could get off, escape this madness. But when the train stopped, it wasn't at a station. Outside was a barren landscape, a vast expanse of snow and ice under a starless sky. Shadows moved in the distance, tall and thin, with glowing red eyes that burned through the darkness. The intercom crackled to life, and a voice spoke, low and gravelly.
"Next up."
The end of the line. I ran to the front of the train, desperate to find the conductor. The door to the driver's cabin was ajar, and I pushed it open. Inside, there was no one. The controls moved on their own, levers shifting and dials spinning as though operated by invisible hands. I turned back, and the passengers were standing in the aisle, their faces fixed on me. They began to chant, their voices low and guttural, the words incomprehensible but filled with malice. The train lurched forward, faster and faster, the wheels screeching against the tracks. Just when I thought I would lose my mind, the train screeched to a halt. The doors hissed open, revealing a station bathed in an eerie green light. A sign hung above the platform, its letters flickering, "Last stop." I didn't wait. I bolted from the train and into the snow, the passengers chanting following me. The cold bit into my skin, and the world around me seemed to twist and blur. Somehow, I found myself on a road, a faint glow of streetlights in the distance guiding me back to safety. When I looked back, the train was gone. No one believed me. The train I described, they said, hadn't run in decades, but every night since, I've heard it, the faint whistle of a train in the distance, growing louder as Christmas Eve approaches. And I know, one day, it will come for me again.